Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Young and Wifed Up. This is Marcella.
And I'm Gabby.
And thanks for joining us today for another episode. I'm sorry if I'm giggling, but this has been our third take now trying to start this intro.
Third time's a charm,
Right.
I guess.
Yeah, okay. If you would like to support us and our podcast, I would highly recommend that you go and become a patron on our Patreon. You can get lots of exclusive content, bonus episodes, merch, video chats, recommendation links, printables, you name it, we have it. And the higher the tier, I think we also have mugs still available.
Oh yeah, we got mugs and stickers for the top two tiers.
Cute. So that is a way to financially support us, to keep our lights on, so we can keep producing content for you guys.
Awesome. If you didn't already know, we also have all of our podcast episodes from the last 3 or 4 seasons. I can't remember how many seasons we've been doing it on YouTube. But if you want to watch us as well as listen to us, you can head to our Patreon if you want to see our beautiful faces, or at least my sister's beautiful face. And the small minority of our audience listens to us and watches us on YouTube, but we're still posting on YouTube for you guys. So if you didn't know, head to our YouTube and you can watch all of our podcast episodes, and you can also watch me rubbing my eye because it's like really itchy all of a sudden. Anyway, so today we're finally talking about food. Okay, so we talk about food a lot on our podcast. It's like an ongoing topic, but we haven't talked about the kind of food that we've been choosing to eat in the past couple years and why. And I don't know, I kind of, for a while, like I wanted to kind of push this podcast off for a while because this can be kind of offensive or considered fringe in some circles. I think it's becoming more widely accepted. But it's still, I still get a variety of reactions from others when they find out that we are eating this certain way now. And I'd say it's more on the recent side. I mean, for me, maybe like strictly about a year and a half, you probably a little bit longer. But kind of like I was like easing into it with some things, and then I went like full force, not looking back about a year and a half ago. And I wanted to kind of talk about our journeys with food. If you haven't already listened to our episode about intuitive eating, now would be a good time to go listen to it. I still consider myself an intuitive eater, and I'm very, very, very grateful for the healing that I've personally experienced with my issues with food and disordered eating and that sort of thing, with intuitive eating principles. But I still, even though I still consider myself an intuitive eater, I, eat a variety of foods. I think that I've seen drastic changes in my health, my mental health, my husband's health and mental health, and just like our overall enjoyment of food has skyrocketed since we started leaning more into what people would consider ancestral eating, Weston A. Price eating, nourishing traditions. So if you have no idea what any of those words mean, don't worry, we're going to get into it. But first, I want to talk about our personal food journeys, how we kind of got here first. So I'll go ahead and go first. So if you haven't already listened to that intuitive eating podcast episode, both of us kind of mention our food journeys, but I'll probably get into it a little bit more. So I grew up eating diet food or dieting from a very young age. I think the first diet that I was on, I was probably 10 because I've always been kind of a bigger girl. I had no idea until 5 years ago that I have polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is a reproductive and metabolic disorder. And I had no idea that that could be affecting how I look and how much I weigh, and how my body processes food, and also how food affects me differently than maybe other people do. I dieted probably very like strictly up until I was an adult. And then, I think my eating when I was a young adult living in Los Angeles was extremely disordered because I was working so much, like 60-hour weeks nonstop, that I would probably have one meal a day, and I would walk everywhere, and I was so thin, but I was also starting to get so sick. And I think so much of my health issues kind of ramping up started with my chronic high cortisol levels from when I lived in Los Angeles, because I had such a
Mhm.
fast-paced, crazy lifestyle, and I didn't eat. Like, I ate maybe one meal a day, like a real meal. The rest was maybe like hot fries
Mhm.
or,
Yeah.
random snacks, that sort of thing. Um, and then after I came home from LA when I was around about to be 20 years old, I started thinking about, I don't even know how I came up with this idea. Well, I basically tricked my sister into doing a pescatarian diet with me. She fell off of it, which she will explain when she talks about her food journey, which I'm so glad she did, because now I'm like, wow, like that poor girl needed red meat so bad. And I like tried to kill her on accident. But I ate pescatarian for a while. And I even probably considered myself to be like pescatarian, but also with chicken, up
Mhm.
until a year and a half ago, essentially. So I ate primarily eggs and fish, and then I ended up including chicken later on. I stayed away from pork, red meat, any other type of meat. And then when I got diagnosed with PCOS, I started eating an autoimmune paleo diet. I was even eating even stricter than that when I was doing an elimination diet to see if I had any food triggers. I was eating plant-based, dairy-free, again, no beef, no pork. And after I was eating the autoimmune paleo diet, I started to include more foods into my diet, but then I was relying on a lot of over processed food alternatives, because I was still not eating dairy, and I was still not eating beef or pork, and I still was very much plant based. I also, during this time, while I was dealing with my PCOS diagnosis, dealing with different autoimmune issues, struggling with my food situation, um, I was going through this journey of like, I'm just so sick of dieting and restrictive eating, and I just feel like there's nothing that I can do. I'm going to be dieting the rest of my life, until I discovered intuitive eating on a fertility podcast that I listened to. I can't remember what fertility podcast it was, but it's probably not one I would recommend anyway, because most of them are super liberal. But somebody had can't remember her name, but she was a dietitian, and she was an intuitive eating dietitian. She talked about a ton of resources. She had her own podcast. And then I was like, this may be the answer to my issues with food, because I would obsess with food. I would restrict myself so much, and I would be so unhappy with food and my body and all that it was just really taking a toll. So again, if you want to learn about intuitive eating and what that actually means, we have an entire podcast episode dedicated to it. That healed, like I said before, a lot of my disordered eating habits. And I still am very, very grateful for intuitive eating and the intuitive eating principles to this day. Um, One thing that I would caution now that I kind of know a lot more about the intuitive eating community, is that some of it can end up turning into some woke stuff. So you kind of have to be a little cautious if you kind of dive deeper into reading the books or listening to the podcast or any other content about intuitive eating, because there's sometimes some overlap between them and fat liberation, which I disagree
Mm.
with and I think is very toxic and scary. And I am a woman that has fat on her body, and I still think that fat liberation is a very evil thing that we should not endorse. But I still am a body positive person, especially if you had children and your body changes, and just loving the body that God has given you. And I am still like very like, loving the body that God has given you and not obsessing over or becoming vain over it. But there is another kind of darker side to it, where people do not care what they put in their body. They do not care
Yeah.
for their health, and you're not allowed to say anything about it. So I fully disagree with that. I think it's a worldly, secular philosophy that we should flee from. That being said, after dealing with the after like the intuitive eating thing. I can't even pinpoint when I started learning about ancestral foods and the Weston A. Price Foundation. It may have been Marcella that had maybe started planting some seeds because again, she's been eating this way longer than I have. But I was very scared when I heard about raw milk. That's Marcella probably has a very vivid memory of her being like, just try it. Because my entire
Yeah.
life, I've been lactose intolerant, or what I thought was. I still think I am lactose intolerant. But I, I was so scared about introducing beef, pork, a lot of meat in general, butter. Like that is like, I was so scared because of everything I was being told by healthcare professionals is that that would make my autoimmune issues exacerbated, it would make my PCOS symptoms exacerbated. But I was already so sick. I was having flare up after flare up after flare up. I
Yeah.
was not
Yeah.
getting better.
It was like, okay, well, what could make it worse at this point?
I know. And so it's like, at some point you get so desperate. And I know, like, if you've ever struggled with chronic health conditions, like, that you just get so desperate to feel better that you're willing to try anything, even if it's something that may kind of like shake your little world, like I was so anti red meat and I was so anti dairy. I was convinced that it was terrible for you, that only baby cows should be having milk, from cows, that sort of mentality. I was completely, I even thought like veganism is like the best way that you can eat. And I was kind of working my way to veganism. I was trying, and it's so crazy, Marcella, the beginning of 2022 or yes, the beginning of 2022, one of my New Year's resolution was to essentially transition into entirely vegan. And
That's crazy
2022,
because
yeah.
that's when I went the opposite direction.
Yeah. And so that was the beginning of the year. By the end of the year, I was already drinking raw milk and starting to like have a drastic lifestyle change with food.
Yeah.
So, all of that to say, how am I feeling now since I said this is maybe a year and a half of me being very, very serious about it? I mean, I've talked about before, my health has changed drastically. One from me coming home, quitting my job, having a slower lifestyle, prioritizing my health, stress, stuff like that. But I genuinely think that applying the Weston A. Price Foundation eating principles, leaning into more an ancestral diet and food eating principles, those things have made such a drastic change in my health that I fully believe that this is the best way that I can eat at this point. I feel great. My husband feels great. We're happy. My mental health is so much better. I have more mental clarity. I have less anxiety. I have less hormonal disruptions. I have way less flare-ups than I had before. I could literally make a list of benefits. And like I'm enjoying food again.
Mhm.
I'm not obsessing over it. I'm not struggling with food anymore. Because I'm so satisfied with my meals. They're so good and so nutritious and taste so wonderful that it's not a struggle for me. I never feel like I'm missing out at all, which is crazy. And so that's kind of like my little journey. I'd like to hear yours now, Marcella.
Before I do that, I do remember when I think you asked me, or maybe I was like trying to convince you, like,
Mhm.
I don't remember who initiated what, but
Somehow we had a conversation.
I remember telling you because we had been drinking raw milk for a little bit at that
Mhm.
point. I don't remember how long it had been, but I was like, I gave you a little jar of the raw milk, and I was
Mhm.
like, try a tiny bit in your coffee, like the tiniest bit, and just like tell me how you feel.
I
And
was
you like try
convinced I was going to be in the emergency room.
and I remember I was like checking in with you like throughout the day, and I was like, "Are you feeling okay?" And you were like, yeah, like, I'm
I was
fine, like,
shocked.
I haven't, like, had any reaction. It was crazy, and then I think it just, like, pipelined from there for you.
Yeah. Oh,
And then
yeah.
also with, like, reintroducing the red meat as well, it was like I think I remember telling you, like, "Okay, we'll start with bone broth and, like, see
Mhm.
how you do with that," and then, like, working your way into, like, eating full-on red meat again. Yeah, I do remember when all of that happened. And it's like, it's so cool now to see your journey from that point and like how much it has improved, like practically like your daily functioning.
Oh, yeah.
It is really cool. Anyway, my food journey, mine is pretty uneventful. I did
Because you
not
have
have
skinny
any
privilege.
I didn't have any interest or need for dieting. I grew up with a very, very, very fast metabolism. I mean, I kind of got like bullied on the other side of the ditch. Like I was
Yes.
called anorexic multiple times throughout like middle school and like, made fun of for being so skinny. And then it was always funny because I could put it away. Like I could eat a lot, but I just would not gain weight. And I think that like I probably did have health issues then
Mhm.
also, and that
Mhm.
could have, I don't know, it could have been a myriad things. I'm not gonna like sit here all day
You could have been
pondering like,
malnourished at some point because you were eating all the diet foods we were eating too in the house, like low fat,
yeah,
like
yeah,
foods, you
probably.
know?
Yeah, probably. Yeah. So I mean, essentially, I didn't really worry about what I was eating because I just ate whatever was at the house. And it's like, if I'm
Mhm.
hungry, I'm gonna eat like whatever is here. But it wasn't really something that was ever at the forefront of my mind. Um, and yeah, I could pretty much eat anything with like little to no consequences or changes to my body. Like I'm pretty sure I weighed the same from like 12 years old up until I was like 20. Like I honestly think like after Jen and I got engaged, something happened to my body. It was very strange. It was the first time in my life that I had actually like gained a substantial amount of weight.
Mhm.
Um and yeah, and now I like you kind of hit like a second puberty again for women, like especially after you have children, like you guys know what I'm talking about, especially if you have kids. Anyway, I did try pescatarian with Gabby for that 1 month. I think was I married? I think
No, because I was living at home. We were both living at home.
okay, yeah. So I think I was like 18.
Yeah.
I must have been 18 when we did that.
Yeah.
And I did it for a month. And like I was convinced, like if somebody blew in my direction, I would fall over. Like I was withering away.
Poor
But
thing.
I think it was like I like lost weight I should not have been losing. And then on top of that, because I like have struggled with iron deficiency for which now I know could be other things, which is like a whole other topic. But yeah, struggling with the iron deficiency and then taking out the red meat, I felt horrible. Like I was so tired all the time and no energy. It felt like I was gonna pass out constantly. It was really bad. So I was like, "You're on your own. I'm not doing this with you anymore because I feel terrible." And then I think in my very early 20s, right after we were married, I went on like a few variations of like a low gluten or a low dairy or a low sugar, like a low inflammatory sort of like what would be deemed inflammatory foods,
Mhm.
quote unquote inflammatory.
Yeah. It's very
Diets.
relative right now. Lots
Yeah,
of
and like
compelling things that a lot of the things that we were told were inflammatory are in fact not inflammatory.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So anyway, but I think I would always advocate for people like you have to go out and look at the data yourself and look at it for
Yes.
yourself. Like we can
Yes.
talk about our anecdotal experiences. We're not professionals talking about this
Oh,
stuff. We're
heck
just
no.
like
Yeah.
sharing our own experiences and like how it's helped us or like changed things or whatever. Um anyway, why not maybe a few variations of that? And I don't know. I don't really remember finding anything significant that changed in the way I felt or the way my body felt or my energy or anything doing those sorts of things. And then I learned about Weston A. Price. It's been almost 3 years now since I first heard about it. And I had heard about it, didn't really like take any action on it. I just remember being like, huh, that's like interesting. I've never like heard that side of what kind of food to eat. But then I remember something, I crossed paths with something. I don't know if it was online somewhere. And this was like very shortly after I had Eli, which
Mhm.
was about 2.5 years ago. And at that point, I was like, I had already kind of entered a more holistic pipeline when I was pregnant with Eli because I wanted to get into more herbalism. I had struggled with my mental health after having Seth, and I was like already looking into that sort of a thing. And I knew I couldn't like go vegan because I already had my pescatarian fail. Like how could I possibly like go all the way? Like that just seemed impossible to me. And so there was this whole other like a whole other side on the other end of the spectrum. And I looked into it more and I was like, hmm, this is very interesting. And so I delved really, really deep into his work, eventually Ray Pete's stuff, which I don't think we're going to touch on today. That's also like I think sometimes their principles
Overlap.
can go
Mhm.
hand in hand. Yeah, they
Mhm.
there's definitely some overlap there. Which like hot take, I think the low sugar thing now is going to be it's it's going to be a fad eventually. Like I think what low fat was for us when we were in high school and like that
Mhm.
era, people are now coming out of. And I think the low sugar thing, people are going to be also coming out of because I'm like also now convinced that like sugar is good for you.
Yeah,
And that's
crazy.
also very, very controversial.
Yeah.
Anyway, so um yeah, so after like I think the first thing that I got to kind of like get into it was the raw milk. And
Mhm.
I'm very thankful that we were living in California at the time because California, it's legal to sell it in retail. So it was very, very easy for me to find. I just like went to our local health food store and they had it. And I remember like Jed, I don't think he was like he didn't really have any concerns about the raw milk thing. And he was like, he thought it was a little weird at first. And he was like, I don't know, like raw, like unpasteurized milk, like, isn't that like really dangerous? And like, I don't know, I like gave him some stuff to like read and like sent him articles and like, obviously the realmilk.org website is like the primary I think info site that you could probably
Yeah,
find
I'm
and
gonna
just the
make
most basic
sure
information.
that for our Patreon subscribers that you guys have a directory that you and I can throw together
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
to kind of
That sounds good.
complement this episode. That way,
Yeah.
they have a landing place for all the stuff that we're talking about.
Right, right, right. Yeah. But I think at that point, Jed was just like, all right, like, this is, if you want to start eating raw milk and raw cheese, and we're gonna, I started getting into like serving more organ meats like throughout the week and like just like different things kind of encompassing what he suggests would be a diet for good health. And yeah, we haven't looked back since.
Mhm.
And I think like maybe at first with like Weston A. Price principles, I was a lot more strict about like absolutely no PUFAs, no, 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 no. And I
Yeah.
think now I've kind of like eased up a little bit on that sort of thing. Not because like I like don't agree with like Weston A. Price and like the conclusions that he's come to with that sort of stuff, or like even Sally Fallon's. But I think sometimes, and I think we're going to talk about this later, when we fear so much of
Mhm.
eating the wrong thing, that can be even worse in your health, even worse
Yes.
on your health than just eating the PUFA. And so it's like you
What is that
kind of,
called? Orthexia, where you're like so obsessed with like eating
yeah,
healthy that it's
yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
consumes you. It's like a
Right.
phobia. Yeah.
Yeah. And I
And
wouldn't
that's
say
a
like,
disordered eating issue.
Right, and I wouldn't say, like, when I first heard about Weston A. Price and all that, we started implementing those things, that I was obsessed over it, but I think I was, like, I put way more effort into,
Mhm.
like, getting all of the right stuff and then, like, the prepping and, like,
Mhm.
all of that, and now I think I've hit more of a good routine that, like, the majority of our diet is still that because I've
Yeah.
found more of my rhythm. But then, like, also life gets crazy when you move across the country and then have a baby within a year, and, sometimes the things just fall off and it's like, "Okay, well, we're having a frozen meal tonight." And, like,
Right.
it's not gonna
Right.
kill us. Like, it's gonna be fine. Like, our bodies are made to mitigate some type of stress at some point. It's
Yeah.
just, we aren't such in a fragile state that, like, wow, if we dare eat anything that's not considered an ancestral diet thing, that it's gonna ruin all the progress that we've made in our
Mhm.
health. Like, it's just not the case anymore. So,
Yeah.
anyway, that's a very long-winded version of my quote unquote uneventful food journey.
Your uneventful food journey ended up being very
Very
eventful.
eventful. Yeah, I guess so.
So I guess we can make some definitions now, what we mean by ancestral eating, why are we name dropping Weston A. Price and Sally Fallon, these people. Um, and again, I want to preface, like Marcella said, we don't completely agree. Like these are the authorities in our life that we will never refrain from any
Deviate.
food that
Yeah,
they
yeah,
say we
yeah.
shouldn't eat. Like technically, I should never eat kale or spinach if I agree with Weston A. Price or Sally Fallon. And I had spinach twice this week in my meals, and I just throw a lot of butter in it. And there are ways that again, because I'm first and foremost an intuitive eater, I eat what I want, I eat what I enjoy, I don't
Mhm.
restrict food. But there's a way where I think we can apply a lot of the principles that they talk about to a variety of foods so that we can kind of live in this kind of like 80-20 or 70-30 lifestyle of like we are primarily eating these really good nourishing foods, and then the other part of it is like pleasure foods, or when we eat out or
Mhm.
when we go over to somebody's house, that sort of
Mhm.
thing. And we'll talk more at the end of the episode of how we kind of balance that a little bit better. So I'm just going to read. I have a script so that I can stay on track. Who these people are and what the ancestral diet is. So the ancestral diet, also known as the primal diet, is based off the idea that eating foods that our ancestors would have consumed during the Paleolithic era. So that means focusing on whole, unprocessed foods, high quality meats and fish, fruits, vegetables, especially root vegetables, sprouted nuts and seeds, while avoiding processed foods. And then also making sure that we eat properly prepared grains and legumes and unpasteurized dairy. The goal is to mimic these eating patterns of people that lived in this era. Wait, hold on. I lost track. Oh, yeah. The goal is to mimic the eating patterns of our hunter gatherer ancestors. So, and it's interesting because we're going to talk next about Weston A. Price. Our ancestors are different
Mhm.
um, depending on your ethnicity. So it's
Mhm.
very interesting when we search back and look back at what our particular ancestors were eating. There's different regions of the world where they were eating a lot of the foods that they were growing or that were naturally occurring, but they were primarily eating animal products. And I know that may be disputed. There's like this huge controversy right now with like people saying that all Indians that live in India are vegetarian or even vegan. And
Mhm.
that's just not the case. There's a very small population of Indians that are strictly vegan, vegetarian, and the rest of the population includes a variety of meats in their diet. So there's a lot of stipulation and argument in the health and nutrition world, like whose ancestors were actually eating a ton of meat, whose
Mhm.
ancestors were eating more grains, more vegetables,
And
that
who
sort of
and
thing.
who's in better health? What are they dying
Exactly.
from? How long are they living?
So
Yeah.
that's kind of where Weston A. Price comes in. So, Weston A. Price was a dentist and a researcher who was well known for his work in the early 20th century. He studied the relationship between diet and health. And the thing that's interesting about him is none of this is like him reading a bunch of resources about other people that went and traveled to these indigenous people. He himself traveled to various indigenous cultures and parts of the world and studied how they ate and what their teeth looked like and their jaws, because he was first a dentist before he got into researching the connection between, health and food. So he was very compelled that the people that were eating what we would call an ancestral or a primal diet, heavily animal-based diet, that their jaws were wide, their teeth were straight, and they were like very like teethy, like very
Mm.
like didn't have a lot of tooth decay, didn't have a lot of issues with their teeth. And he was convinced that the way that they were eating was actually impacting their dental health. Price's research led him to believe that traditional diets rich in nutrient dense foods like organ meats, fish, raw dairy, red meat, fermented foods, they were key to their optimal health, dental health, and overall well-being. So his findings have influenced a lot of what we believe now regarding nutrient dense foods and how we should be eating even now in modern times, even though our food and our farming, a lot of things have changed. So we are now in the era of factory farming. We're in the era of, in crazier, even recently, laboratory farming.
Mhm.
um, Pasteurization, like up the wazoo, of not just dairy, but fruits, vegetables, juices, pasteurizing everything. Everything needs to be overly cleaned, overly, stripped,
Sanitized. Yeah.
sanitized, stripped of any bacteria, whether it be good or bad. Um, so Weston A. Price is a very prominent figure whenever you talk about animal-based, ancestral, even a lot of paleo people like his work too. But Sally Fallon, she is still alive. So Weston A. Price is not alive anymore, but Sally Fallon, she is the writer, the author, along with Mary Enig, which I've never heard her talk before. I don't know if she was just an original writer with her, or she did her forward, or what they did together. But she's also listed as the author. She wrote a book called Nourishing Traditions, and this was based upon the work of Weston A. Price, and it was published in 1996, and it has now become a popular resource for those of us that are interested in traditional diets. This book emphasizes the importance of returning to traditional food preparation methods that have been used for centuries, such as fermenting, soaking, and sprouting grains, legumes, and stuff like that. It promotes the consumption of whole, unprocessed foods, including pasture-raised meat and eggs, wild caught fish, organic and in-season fruits and vegetables, dairy products, raw dairy products, not pasteurized dairy products, and then traditional fats such as butter and lard and tallow. Um, Nourishing Traditions also delves into the health benefits of these, various preparation methods and foods that you can eat. And she highlights in her book how they can support digestion, boost nutrient absorption, and contribute to overall well-being. I have heard countless testimonies, and I think I'll be able soon, Lord willing, now that a lot of my symptoms have been put into remission. I've heard so many testimonies of people that have chronic illness or autoimmune conditions that have healed or put their symptoms into remission through eating these sorts of foods. Primarily, right? We're not saying eat perfect, but primarily eating these foods. So I'll add again this book to the list of resources. And this was probably the first book that you and I both read that, like, the canon essentially of a lot of
Mhm.
it. Now, again, I don't agree with everything Sally Fallon says. Um, According to her, I should not ever be drinking coffee, and I drink coffee every day. I drink purity coffee. It's mold free, mycotoxin free. So I still apply the principles of eating whole foods that are very like clean as far as free of mycotoxins and anti-nutrients. So I tried to find like the cleanest coffee beans I could get. They're, I know where it's growing, they're organic, stuff like that. But she would say that we should never drink coffee. So again, there are a lot of things that maybe we don't necessarily agree with every single thing that these, people have said, but we can appreciate a lot of the work that they've done to research and to put forth, these resources for us to consider, even just consider applying them to our homes and how we cook and how we feed our children. So, Marcella, can you get into what the eating principles are? And this is directly from the Weston A. Price Foundation. Again, a great resource. I use the Weston A. Price Foundation website like a Google about food, about recipes and stuff like that. So maybe you could talk about the 10 more prominent principles.
Yeah, so the first one, which I feel like is just the easiest generally to follow, and it's eating whole unprocessed foods as often as you can. So it can include foods like fresh fruits, vegetables, if you want to get even more detailed, seasonal produce. Even sometimes people think about where you are, your latitude. I forgot what they call it, but like where you are in the country, like what is growing locally to where you live, or even like we're
Locally grown.
talking, yeah, locally grown, or even like what you were saying before, what your ancestors based off of your ethnicity were eating. So like for us, like we have we come from Hispanic backgrounds. We also have, European backgrounds. And so we could maybe have more beans and rice. But are you preparing them properly? Are you soaking your beans? Are you soaking your rice? Are you soaking your grains and legumes and all of that? This on the notes it says whole grains, but I think like they would probably say soaked, sprouted, whole grains,
Fermented.
fermented, sourdough bread, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Pasture raised meats. Also, organ meats. I think I don't know if they cover that.
It does end up later, I think. Oh, maybe it's not. Huh.
Yeah, definitely more organ meats, wild caught fish, raw dairy products. And then on top of that, a lot of healthy fats. And I think this is probably the most important for women who are in their childbearing years,
Oh,
as
yes.
well as children, infants,
Growing
if you're
children.
starting solids with infants and that sort of a thing. Healthy fats, butter, coconut oil, lard, tallow. I know, I think red palm oil. I think there might be red palm oil or something that Sally talks about in Nourishing Traditions also.
Yeah.
And trying to avoid processed oils like vegetable oils, canola, sunflower oil, things
Cotton
like that.
seed, safflower. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which once you start looking at packaging, if you get processed food ever or packaged food ever, you will start to see these inflammatory oils everywhere. And then you
Yeah.
realize how hard it is to avoid.
Buy. Yeah. So, I mean, in some ways, trying to avoid those things can definitely grow your kitchen skills because you realize you either have to pay up the wazoo to find something that doesn't have seed oils in it, or you just have to learn to make it yourself.
Yeah.
And I think it definitely grew my skills in the kitchen.
Oh,
because
yes.
It was like, I don't want to buy baked goods from the store anymore. I don't want to buy bread from the store anymore. I don't want to buy this, that, and the other, because if I can find a way to make it at home, I'm going to find a way to make it at home. Animal products, I think we kind of already touched on this, like eggs, meats, especially like if you can get like, I know people are like very afraid of like fat on the meat, like chicken breast is much better than chicken thighs. But I think like the fattier pieces of meat are also very good for you as well. I think
Yes.
there's a time and a place for leaner cuts of meat, but I think we shouldn't shy away from fattier pieces
Our
of meat.
ancestors ate everything.
The
And
whole yeah.
whatever they didn't eat, they used. So
Mhm.
it's like,
Yes.
and it's hard for me because I, again, coming from a heavily plant-based pescatarian diet, it is still hard for me to chew on fat.
Gristle or yeah,
It's
yeah.
hard. I have to remind myself this is good for me. This is edible. This is like and it has gotten better over time. But sometimes I spit it out because it's too much. But again, it's a learning process, especially if you're accustomed to eating only lean or white, what they would consider white meat.
Yeah. 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 Raw dairy products from animals raised in their natural environments. Also things like bone broth that has a lot of collagen, gelatin, minerals. It's good for your gut health generally. I know some people who have histamine issues don't respond as well to like very um like long, what's the word I'm looking for? Like simmered for a very long time, like over a certain amount of time.
Mm,
I think sometimes people don't react as well to the bone broth. You kind of have to um, trial and error that one.
yeah.
But I use a lot of bone broth for a lot of things, even with soaking grains and things like that. Fermented foods, sauerkraut, kimchi, kefir, yogurt, things that are rich in probiotics and enzymes that can support your digestion and immune system. Properly prepared grains, nuts, legumes, kind of like we were talking about, soaking, sprouting, fermenting, as much as you can that the food and the grain is already been broken down so that your body doesn't have to do as much of the work. So you're
Hmm.
breaking down the acid and like all of those different things. Um, and what I usually like to do, especially with things like oatmeal, I like to just get pre-sprouted
Yeah, I
oats.
get sprouted grains
You
as much
could,
as possible.
yeah, and sometimes like I think there are ways that you can sprout your own grains at home. I know I probably wouldn't have like the mental capacity to keep track of like actually sprouting all of my own grains, and so um when I buy things like oats and things like that, I try to just buy them sprouted already. And soaking is just so much, it's very easy to soak grains.
Yeah, soaking is
um
free.
yes, it
I
takes
always tell
little to
people
no time and
if
effort.
you want to one lower the phytic acid in all grains, legumes, rice, anything like that. If you want to lower the glycemic index, if you have
Mhm.
blood sugar issues or insulin resistance issues like me, it is free
To
to
soak your
soak your
grains.
grains in water. And you could bump it up a notch by like adding a little sourdough starter or adding some apple
Apple
cider
cider vinegar.
vinegar.
Yeah.
There's ways that you can kind of like boost it even more. But if all you have is water and a bowl, you can soak your grains and and okay, so you still are getting the benefits of what you're eating without
Mhm.
all of the consequences, of phytic
Yeah.
acid and stuff. And everything that we're talking about, all the resources that we're going to add to the Patreon will kind of help you to be able to like navigate like, okay, I'm interested in this soaking grain thing, but we'd have to have an entire episode dedicated to it. So it's like, this is kind of a
It's very
compact,
baseline
this is a very
information. Yeah.
baseline information. So if it's overwhelming to you, again, this took me a year and a half to finally be like, okay, like we are eating this way permanently, this is how we eat in our home, and it took me
Mhm.
time to learn, the fats that I can get. Where can I source my raw dairy? How can I learn to make sourdough bread? How can I soak and sprout things? Like, how can I ferment things at home? Like, what are the sweeteners that I want to use? Like, how am I going to bake? Like, it takes time. So if you're interested in this way of eating, like, don't feel like, okay, we have to have a mega overhaul and change everything at once. That's not the case. Baby steps,
Mhm.
small changes can make a drastic difference in your health and your family's health.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
can continue.
Um, Natural sweeteners in moderation. Honey, maple syrup, molasses are usually preferred over refined sugars, but they should still be consumed in moderation. I think this is maybe where Ray Peat differs with Weston
Hmm.
A. Price. Type. Sorry, I keep rubbing my eye.
It's okay. I keep
Um,
sniffing. I don't know why I'm so congested right now. We were outside for a few hours today, so it could be it. Allergies.
um, but yeah, I most of the time, if I'm making baked goods or whatever, I just use organic cane sugar. I
Me
think
too. Don't tell on me.
there's also like, I mean, I also use like honey and syrup for a lot of things. Like
Yeah.
I
Oh yeah.
rarely ever use sugar in my coffee or
Right. We use maple
tea,
syrup.
or
Yeah.
if I'm making snacks for the kids, like for granola bars, I don't really use, I don't think I use any sugar. It's like honey, and I think the rest of it's maple syrup. And it's like, I kind of pick and choose, but
Mm-hmm.
like, I am not afraid of the white sugar, and I don't
Neither
mind
am
using
I.
it.
Yeah, I think coffee and sugar is where I start to veer off.
Yes, the
Where
coffee.
I'm
Yes,
like,
I was going to say the coffee thing too is also like a very Ray Peat principle as well that I think Weston Price would, or maybe more so Sally Fallon. I don't know if Weston A. Price specifically says anything about coffee, but I think
Sally Fallon
Sally
definitely
Fallon
does. Oh
does
yeah,
not
she does
suggest
not like
coffee.
coffee. She's like, nobody should be drinking coffee. It's a stimulant. Get it out. And
Yeah,
I'm like,
yeah.
la, 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 la,
But yeah, on like the other side, it's like Ray Pete's. Like I think as long as you're his thing is like as long as you're not drinking it black, like you are having it with milk and
fat.
sugar,
Yes.
that is
Which is
where
so
you're
funny because
getting
people think that black coffee is
the
the
better way.
healthiest, but
Yes.
it's actually if you add some fat to it and sugar to it, it's so interesting that
Yeah,
your
and
body digests it better.
yeah, and we need to stop because I'm gonna start nerding out really bad, and it's gonna be way too long.
Okay, we'll have
Anyway,
to talk later because I'm like, I need to talk about this.
avoiding processed and refined foods. Another thing with the sugar thing is that usually when people look at the processed foods, you're buying a lot of packaged stuff at the
Mhm.
store, and it's like, oh, it's because of all the sugar and the salt in it that's in it. And it's like, no, it's probably because of like all of the laboratory ingredients and all the seed oils that
Right.
they're
The
using.
non-food issues. Yeah.
That's probably what's causing more of the issues than sugar. Like
Mhm.
I would be like, yeah, like I said, I don't have a problem with the sugar. Um, so including foods like avoiding things like refined sugars, white flour. I don't have a problem with the white flour. I think as long as I think it's better if you are able to ferment it. If
Oh,
you're able
yes.
to make
Yeah.
sourdough stuff, I think it is better, generally better
Mhm.
for your gut.
It's also the
Um,
most accessible flour and affordable flour. So I always
yes,
say like if you have to use white flour, which I use a lot of, and that's what I
yes,
use my sourdough for, get unbleached and organic as much as possible because that
yeah.
will matter how much the wheat was sprayed, if it was bleached, if it was overly processed. Of course,
If
like the
there's like
best
synthetic
yeah,
vitamins
if
and
we had all the money in the world, we would all be milling our own grain, you know, and I think one day I would love to have my own like little attachment for my KitchenAid to be able to mill my own grain and buy wheat berries. But it's like it's affordable, it's accessible, you could buy it at any store and you know, and you can do so much with it and you can
yeah,
ferment it. So
yeah, and you
even if
can make
white
it more gut
flour
friendly.
isn't the best for you, it's
Mhm.
still better for you than buying store-bought baked goods.
Yeah.
Period.
And then processed meats, artificial additives, sort of like I think generally most people would say like you should avoid those things anyway. And then like we were talking about, cooking at home as much as possible is such a good way, even if you're like, well, I can't really like afford to go to the farmer's market like every weekend and like doing all this stuff. But it's like, okay, is there, for instance, like a takeout place you guys really love to go to or fast food? And is there a way that you can make something like that at home?
Yeah.
Can you replace the store-bought granola bars with making your own granola bars at home? And like you
Mhm.
kind of have to like work your way up to a lot of made from scratch type stuff and like building your repertoire that way.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes it's like, wow, I have to cut out all this stuff, and it's like, no, 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 start small. Like you have to
Right.
start very with something that can be sustainable. And obviously, ideally, you want to support local and sustainable agriculture as much as you possibly can. So when you can, you know, buying things that are locally sourced. Like, do you have a local farmers market that you can go to and buy from the organic farmers
Right.
or local butchers or ranchers or whoever it
Or a
is?
friend that has a couple chickens and she
Yeah,
can give
yeah,
you
exactly.
eggs.
Yeah, literally. Like, yeah, like like Shannon has her chickens and she's given me like huge bags of like chicken feet so I can make bone broth with the chicken feet. And it's like, I
Yeah.
would rather like get it from her than like getting it from, somewhere else or from the store or wherever. And so I feel like that's always the better option, free from synthetic chemicals and hormones and
Hmm.
all that sort of thing. So, yeah, there's definitely still a balance that needs to be found. These are
Yes.
just principles. I'm not saying we follow these to a T.
No.
And like we gave a few examples where we kind of veer off from maybe what Sally Fallon would recommend or
Hmm.
Weston Price would recommend. Or sometimes it's just a matter of like, let's say your husband really likes the processed meal that you made and that it contained all of the PUFA containing ingredients and you're trying to avoid it at all costs, but it's like, are you going to deprive your husband of a meal he really loves because you're trying to so strictly stick by
Yeah.
this, certain type of eating? Like, we just can't be so narrow
Right.
minded in that way. Like, there's so much more that like comes with quote unquote dieting and how we approach food and that sort of thing. So I don't know if you want to start talking more about that.
Yeah, I guess one thing that has helped me whenever I talk to people about how we've been eating is that, like, I always say, and I even tell my doctors this, like, I eat 70% clean, ancestral, I care about proper preparation of foods that may be harder for me to digest. But I don't sweat it with the other 20, 30%. I just don't sweat it. Again, like, because I'm an intuitive eater, like, I listen to my body. If I have a craving for Taco Bell, I'm going to go get freaking Taco Bell. Like, I'm sorry. Like,
Mhm.
that might offend people. It might be like you're fake or you're you're a hypocrite,
You poser.
a poser, whatever. But I'm like, life, like, food is not, God did not give us food just for sustaining our bodies. It's also for
Mhm.
pleasure. He made food taste good. And we've done so many, like, there's so much like good that can be done with not restricting the kind of foods that we eat. It's also like, what are we communicating to our children? Like, are we going to put our nose up to the people that are cooking for us in their homes because we're like, oh, they don't eat like I do. So, it's not good for fellowship. It breaks fellowship with other people. And that's actually one interesting thing that I liked about, I think it's the episode called Food Fussiness by the podcast Bright Hearth. They talk about this in length, and I really
Oh
appreciate, and
yeah.
they also eat very Weston A. Price, very ancestral themselves. And they're like, being a food fuss, if it's not for genuine allergies,
Yeah.
or actual, health, like, this is going to be
Safety issues.
detrimental, it's unsafe, like,
Hmm.
don't be a food fuss. Like, don't be that person. For the most part, most everybody in my direct community doesn't really know, like, how strict we are at home with food.
Hmm.
Because when I go to their house, I eat their meal. When I go to
Hmm.
fellowship at churches, I'm not, I eat what's being given to me. When we go
Hmm.
out to eat, I eat joyfully and I say a prayer before my meal, even if I'm scared that, there's, food that might hurt me or whatever, like, I do avoid dairy when I'm not eating raw dairy, or unprocessed dairy. So when we go out and we eat at people's homes, like, I do get sick if I have pasteurized dairy. So that's still something that I'm very
Yeah,
still
yeah. Like, yeah,
cautious
we're
with.
not saying like you better still eat whatever is put in front of
Yeah,
you,
no, no, no.
even if you're gonna have an anaphylactic reaction to
No,
it.
no,
Like,
no. Like,
obviously, like, have common sense
yes, I
about what
still
you
use
know is
discernment when
gonna.
I'm eating.
Yeah.
If I know something's going to make me sick, I, politely decline, but I'm not going to be a food Nazi
Mm.
when I'm not at
Yeah,
home.
like, did you cook this in grass-fed butter? Okay, then
Yeah.
I don't want it. Like, wow, you used,
Like, is this
olive
chicken have
oil? How
antibiotics
dare.
in it?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like, yeah, yeah.
I'm
That's being ridiculous at that
Yeah.
point.
And that again makes you an annoying person and somebody that
Mhm.
nobody wants to be around. Sorry. Like it just does. Like we
Yeah.
shouldn't be like that. We should have fellowship with others. And food is such a big part of fellowshipping with others. So that's
Mhm.
kind of a way that I balance, what I believe is healthy eating, doing it at home primarily, but also not being restrictive. If I have a craving or if we want to go out, I enjoy my food unto the glory of God. Or if we go and fellowship with others or we go out with others, or if I'm staying in somebody else's home, I am not sweating it. Like I pray for my
Mhm.
meal, ask the Lord to bless it. And I pray that sometimes if we're eating something that I'm like, oh man, like this is never something that I would eat at home, I just pray like, Lord, please protect me, protect my body from what I believe may harm it, from what I'm
Mhm.
eating. And then I just eat it joyfully, you
And you
know,
let go.
let
Yeah.
it go.
Yeah, and I
It's not
I
worth
think
it.
there's definitely something to be said. Again, we're not talking about if you do have real visceral reactions to food, you obviously should not be eating them.
Right.
But, like, I think there's definitely been a fad of being gluten-free, dairy-free, this, that, and the other, and having all these labels when it's
That
like,
are
okay,
more by
but
choice, like a personal choice. Yeah.
right, exactly.
Yeah.
And, I mean, even what we're talking about, like,
Yeah.
I mean, do I have a visceral reaction if I have some canola oil? I mean, no, not really. If I have a lot of it, like over a
Yeah.
period of days, yeah, I start to feel pretty terrible and like my
Mhm.
stomach is not happy with me. But like if I have a baked good that was from the store that somebody brought to church or whatever for the
Right.
fellowship meal, I'm not gonna keel over.
No,
Like that's just
you're
not the
gonna be
case. And
okay.
so yeah. And I think like I was saying, there's like something to be said about if you are so fearful of what you're eating and so stressed that you've deviated from what you would deem to be the perfect diet, you are most
Mhm.
likely doing more harm to your health than if you had just eaten that thing. And so I think like when we put so much emphasis on having this very perfect pristine, I can't let anything enter my body that is not going to like make it perfectly healthy and like all that stuff and like that I'm so scared of eating anything else. For one, I think that's sinful to have that sort of
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
mentality.
Yeah, yeah.
But also like there is a real thing like okay, you're going to be afraid of everywhere that you go. You are never allowed to eat out ever again. There is no chance you would ever go to a meal with family for a birthday or anything like
Mhm.
that because you're so afraid of, you know, anything that could possibly like make you sick or, you
Mhm.
know, shed a year off of your life.
Yeah.
Like the fear itself, like the stress that you're causing your body of being such in a state of like, I'm so scared of everything. Like that
Mhm.
is also just not a good place to be in either. And
Yeah.
I think we just at that point we're giving too much weight to the food and like you were saying, like fussing over it. And then at that point I think we are like in sin if that if
Yeah, you're
that's our
making it an
approach.
idol,
Yeah.
essentially. Yeah.
Yeah, if that's your approach to it.
So, my last question, and again, mine is always subject to change because if I'm like, I'm going to do this with my kids, anything could change. You never know. But I hate like, and it happens. Sometimes I'll say it like, oh, when we have kids, I'm definitely doing this or I'm definitely not doing that. And sometimes, that does end up changing. But do we plan to feed our children the way that we are eating? So my answer right now is, I mean, this is what I'm cooking for me and my husband and he's on board and he
Mhm,
feels great. He was also kind of a little hesitant or maybe, like don't take my chips away kind of thing. And we do buy
mhm,
chips. We just buy chips that have that are cooked in better oils. But my plan is to, follow the Weston A. Price or Sally Fallon or, a lot of the guidelines that they use for feeding babies and infants and children and stuff like that.
mhm,
Um, that's my plan because I mean, if I believe that this is good for my health, then how much more will I think it's good
mhm.
for our little ones? So, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, currently applies like whatever Jed and I are eating, the kids are going to eat. Like, I'm not going to make like a separate meal for them. So, like, obviously, like, you said, um, if we're
Mhm.
benefiting from it. I think there are maybe in some ways things can differ between men and women and between adults and children, and kind of like children have, I think more of a dietary need for like high quality fats, animal fats, and like things like that. And women do as well. Maybe not men quite as much. I don't see it emphasized quite as much. I think it is still important, and like
Oh, yeah, yeah.
they should still be eating animal fats, but it's not like as
The amount that we
um
have to eat is a lot more than what they
yes.
have to.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Like I
Because
think
of our
men
excess
yes,
hormones.
and I think men can get away with having a bit of a lower fat content in their diet than women and children
Mhm.
can.
I think of it as
Um,
a weaker vessel sort of thing,
yeah,
where like God made men's bodies more resilient in a lot of ways,
yeah,
many different ways.
yeah.
Um, and women, like, we just need a lot more nourishing, tender care. We need a lot more like attention
And
to
that
our diet.
a little bit more of a protective layer on our bodies.
Yes,
And
we
I
need
think
more
there
fat on our bodies than men
yeah, yeah,
do.
yeah. And I think there's also like something to be said for new fathers as well.
Mhm.
That like there were couples who were put on this like preconception fertility type um, regimen of eating for both the man and the woman to make sure that they were, at optimal health, and even
Fertility,
to
yeah.
help like the father to help with the stress of having, a newborn, trying to take
Mhm.
care of his wife postpartum and like those sorts of things. So there's like a lot of yeah,
There's
there's a
some
lot of stuff.
nuances.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, there's definitely nuances, but yeah, obviously I mean, how I eat is how my children are also eating, and that has definitely changed a lot, like, since we first had Seth, I didn't
yeah,
know about this, and
yeah.
so, but then when Eli was starting solids, I felt like I was able to start him off on that
Mm,
path, and I think I've even noticed again, this is, like, anecdotally, like, differences in health between Seth and Eli. And
mhm.
so it is very interesting when you look at all the research and all the information out there.
Yeah,
And
definitely worth looking into further if you haven't already.
yes,
There's 2 more things that I want to mention, and maybe if you had any closing thoughts. The first thing is that I know a lot of this stuff can be overwhelming, especially for people that maybe have a tighter budget or if they are on
yes,
welfare assistance,
hmm
stuff like that. And I want to be sensitive to this because I do think a lot of the way that Ryan and I have been able to be a lot more strict or picky with meat or dairy or organic food or a lot of that stuff has to do with the financial situation that we're in now. But I also want to encourage you that there are ways that you can eat this way if you're interested and you're compelled by the research. There are so many ways that you can make drastic changes to your family's health just by learning, like Marcella said, to cook from scratch with real ingredients. It doesn't
hmm
always have to be organic. It doesn't always have to be the best of the best food. But learning, like seeing what is accessible to you at the time and implementing when you can. And as God, one, grows your family, maybe grows your budget a little bit more. And that's something you could commit to Him in prayer. I've prayed
hmm
for God to increase, our budget so that we could be able to buy meat in bulk. And God
hmm
did. And I was so thankful for that. And sometimes it's just me needing to ask, like, Ryan, is there any way that we can sacrifice in one area so that we can prioritize food a little bit more? And we were able to. And so sometimes more conversations need to happen with you and your husband. And again, Marcella and I would never recommend you changing your entire family's lifestyle with food without
hmm
including your husband. That is huge. Please include him.
I
Tell
think,
him what you're researching.
yeah,
Tell him what you're listening to. Tell him what we talked
yeah.
about.
I think
Like,
also there are ways that you can be a disservice to your children if you are all of a sudden forcing down their throats liver and these things that
yes.
they are not used to, and it's like
Hmm.
you have to be gracious and
Hmm.
find a way to wean them into
Yes.
those sorts of things. And there are, because like all the food that he recommends is so delicious. Like,
Oh, it's
who
so
doesn't
good.
love butter? Like,
Real
come
food.
on.
Real
Like,
food is
it's
always
yes.
better.
It's yeah, and it always just tastes so good. There are definitely ways to like um change what you guys are eating, but not make it just like so drastic
A
and so
burden.
crazy. And
Yes.
like like you were saying, I always think submitting to your husband's budget is way more important than having the perfect diet, or I got to make sure that all of my meat is from regenerative agriculturally like
Mhm.
raised, and like all these different things that I only can buy from farmers market. And it's like, we know it gets very
Mhm.
expensive,
Oh,
especially
yeah.
when you are on a smaller budget. And there have been many times, still to this day, where there are things that I'm like, man, I wish I could get this, and this. And I'm like, you know what?
It's just not time. Yeah.
And it's fine. I'm not going to
Yeah.
complain about it. I'm not
Right.
going to moan about it. And it's like, it is more important that you just submit to the budget or to the income that your husband has provided, as opposed to like, you know, going all out because you think this is more important.
Mhm.
I don't think it's worth it at
I
all.
agree. Yeah, the last thing I wanna say that might be it's kind of like on the flip side of, the money conversation is our identity with food. I can speak for myself, and I know that there may be a lot of people listening to us that may have identified themselves with a type of eating for a very long time, and it can be very humbling and even embarrassing to admit that maybe we were wrong about something. So sometimes I listen to the podcast episodes that we did in our first couple years of the podcast, and I cringe at me promoting a dairy-free diet or a
Mhm.
non-red meat diet and stuff like that, or me, because that's what I was eating and I believed in it. And I think there has to be an aspect of like examining, like, food is food. It for the most part, if you're not sinning or if you're not making it an idol or if you're not indulging in gluttony or,
Mhm.
starving yourself and hurting your body, like harming yourself, um, it's not a moral issue,
Mhm.
So if you have gone from, like for me, I speak for myself, heavily plant-based, verging on veganism, being very attracted to that, being convinced by the arguments and that stuff, um, having to kind of not no longer identify with that and say, I was wrong. I thought that this was healthy for me, but now that I'm looking at back at how I was feeling and contrasting it with how I'm feeling now, I was wrong. And I would like go to the mat, that I would never eat this or that, or that this is so bad for you and it's so, unnatural for us to be having animals and that sort of thing. And it's a very humbling experience, but I want to encourage you, if you are listening and you struggle with that sort of thing of like identifying yourself with a type of eating and then maybe like changing your mind. Like it's okay, Like
Mhm.
I know that like being dairy free or, that sort of thing was a big part of my identity. And so like I'm patient with people if people are like, "Oh, like you don't have dairy, blah blah blah," blah," and then they're confused why I'm like posting on my homemaking page about raw milk or butter and they're like, "Wait, what?"
Mhm.
And it's like being okay with saying, I've changed my mind about this. I've been convinced that we can eat this and it's actually better for me now. And it's okay. And so I just want to like throw that out there because I know that I struggled with that when I was first like coming into like the research and being really compelled and convinced and seeing how it was changing my health. I was a little bit scared about what people would think about the
Mhm.
way that I'm eating. And I'm even scared now, just like posting this
Talking about it.
podcast because,
Yeah.
I'm admitting, that I was wrong or that I disagree with how I ate before. I disagree with how I demonized a lot of foods. Um, and it's okay. Like it's okay. The when we were growing up, we learn more information, we get access to different things and we're like, I think I'm compelled by this, let's try it. you know? And so I've been kind of quiet about it as far as not being like super like outspoken. Like you've maybe seen things on my low waist homemaker or maybe little hints of it on our podcast before, but like to straight up say like I was wrong and I'm glad that I was like, I am so glad that I was wrong. Like, it's okay, you know, it's going to be okay. So if that's you and you need to just talk to somebody about it, like send me a DM, girl. Like I'm right there with you. Like I'm embarrassed too. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to touch about that.
No, I think we covered most of, I mean, I guess like yeah, we can talk about all this stuff. Obviously, it's your responsibility to go and figure out and to talk with your husband to see what's going to be best for your family and for your health situations and for, you know, your kids and like all that stuff. But I mean, like you said, in the end, food is just food. And
and it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
And I love food and I am not ashamed to say grateful.
That. Yes.
I love food. It is a gift from God and we should enjoy it without worrying about it.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for joining us on today's episode. Join us next week to hear about all of our spring favorites. Talk to you next time. Bye.
Bye.